Coming up, integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level, he said. Give Rishi Sunak a chance, they said. Even though he wasn't even elected by his own party, let alone by the UK population. Even though we'd already seen how, as Chancellor, he'd raised the tax burden to the highest level of our lifetimes. Even though he failed to support the self-employed through the pandemic lockdowns. Even though he has a history of opposing measures to prevent climate change and backed measures to curtail equality and human rights. He may appear to be the face of diversity, but Rishi Sunak is an incredibly privileged person with access to education and resources that the majority of those with South Asian heredity in the UK do not have. In reality, he has little in common with 99% of the British South Asian community, and he's someone who's proud to boast of his distance from the British working class too.
I have friends who are aristocrats, I have friends who are upper class, I have friends who are, working class, but I'm not working class.
It's clear he doesn't like to associate with the working class, but who you do choose to associate with says a lot about you as a human being, and Sunak's choices say an awful lot. Stay tuned. If you enjoy watching the Truth to Power channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me out by hitting the like button and especially by sharing a link to this video on your social media platforms. One of Rishi Sunak's first actions as Prime Minister was to stand outside Downing Street and promise the nation a government with integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level.
This government will have integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level.
Words that have proved completely hollow and meaningless in every aspect of his performance so far. Not least regarding the appointments he's made to his cabinet. A real rogues gallery of extremists, liars and incompetence. It's mostly familiar faces like the mediocre Jeremy Hunt or James Cleverly, with some ministers moving jobs and others getting old jobs back. Another example is Sue Ellen Braverman, or Suella as she prefers, despising her own parents' affection for the character in the American soap Dallas. Sue Ellen returned to the cabinet barely a week after she was sacked by Prime Minister Truss for multiple security breaches and making a mockery of the ministerial code. But in fact, all Sunak's senior ministerial appointments have previously held posts in the clown show of the Johnson government, and many have also breached the ministerial code or have had disciplinary sanctions imposed on them in the fairly recent past. But let's start with Cruella Braverman, or whatever it is that she prefers to call herself. Our Home Secretary once more, even though she was sacked from the same job by Liz Truss for sharing multiple official documents with multiple unauthorised people using her personal, insecure email address. And around Westminster, the feeling was the sacking had been coming for a while because Braverman went rogue under Truss, declaring weird policies contradicting the stated views of her own boss on a daily basis. During her time as Home Secretary, Braverman previously claimed to have contributed to a legal textbook, but the author of said textbook, Philip Colvin KC, King's Counsel, contradicted her claim, saying she made no written or editorial contribution to the book, saying only that, on one occasion, I asked her to do some photocopying for the book, which she did. Braverman has not responded to journalists' questions about this and has given no explanation for the discrepancy between the two accounts. Braverman's bonkers and illegal Rwanda people trafficking policy has cost millions of pounds of public money, enough to give the RMT and the post office workers the inflation-matching pay rises they're seeking. And this Rwanda policy was just doomed from the start. Yet Sunak himself continues to back Braverman's bonkers policy. Braverman has been condemned across the political spectrum for her racist language, describing asylum seekers as an invasion a day after the far-right terrorist attack on the Manston Asylum Processing Centre. She has said herself, "The system is broken. Illegal immigration is out of control." Yet it is her who has been in control of it for some time now, and she seems herself to have accepted that the illegal overcrowding at the Manston Immigration Centre was partly her responsibility. Braverman then goes on to insult large sections of the electorate by using culture wars language like her bizarro, Guardian-reading, tofu-eating wokerati speech in the Commons. I read The Guardian, and I happen to be very fond of tofu. And I'm seriously concerned that my own country's Home Secretary views me as somehow the enemy, as a sector of society that deserves to be vilified and attacked. It put me in mind of that poem by Pastor Martin Niemöller. To paraphrase it, then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the Guardian-reading, tofu-eating wokerati, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Sunak reappointed Braverman as Home Secretary, bringing her back despite her serious breaches of the ministerial code, and standing by her despite her clear unsuitability for one of the 4 great offices of state. Because after all, it's not as if he ever said he wanted
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Then there's Dominic Raab, Sunak's Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary. Raab is Dutch for turnip, and that's why everyone called him the Turnip during his Brexit dealings in Brussels as Foreign Secretary. The Turnip's flagship policy is a Bill of Rights bill, which looked to be dead and buried when Truss took office and sacked him as Justice Secretary in all those short weeks ago. But following his short sabbatical, human rights campaigners have their head in their hands at the prospect of a return for his widely condemned human rights curtailing proposal to allow UK courts to ignore rulings from Winston Churchill's beloved European Court of Human Rights. Raab was also accused of being missing in action when he was away on holiday during the fall of Kabul in August 2021 while Foreign Secretary, lying on a sun lounger sipping cocktails and refusing to make a simple telephone call authorising the evacuation of Afghan interpreters and other allies of the British forces. His inaction was said by some to have led to many killings of Afghans who had served Britain. Sunak reappointed Raab and is standing by him because, after all, it's not as if he ever said he wanted
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Then we have the guy with the multiple personality disorder, known as Grant Shapps when he's doing his cabinet minister impression, but who goes by the name of Michael Green when he is selling get-rich-quick schemes, and by the names Corinne Stockheath and Sebastian Fox in other business ventures that he originally denied being involved with, and later stated that perhaps he had over-firmly denied. He's also known for doctoring his own Wikipedia page, removing the names of personal donors, along with references to his less than impressive GCSE achievements at Watford Grammar School. It's not too clear how the appointment of Shapps to the post of business minister chimes with Sunak's stated goal of
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
And next we have Michael Gove, Sunak's housing minister, returning to cabinet after being sacked by Johnson in the summer. This coked-up veteran politician has been in and out of cabinet for the last 12 years and exemplifies the dishonesty of Sunak in trying to present himself as heading up a brand new government who shouldn't be held accountable for the last 12 years of utter decline in British public life. Gove is, of course, the central figure in the corruption scandal arising from the red carpet fast-track system of awarding PPE and other contracts to Tory donors and ministerial cronies during the pandemic. Just one example is a firm owned by the finance manager of Michael Gove's 2016 Tory leadership campaign, who won £170 million in PPE deals after being referred to the PPE VIP lane by the office of, wait for it, Michael Gove. On top of this, another story has come to a head in recent days with the Michelle Mone affair. The Guardian revealed last month that bank records indicated Tory peer Lady Mone and her children secretly received £29 million originating from the profits of a PPE business that was awarded large government contracts after, let me use ex-minister Matt Hancock's words here, extraordinarily aggressive lobbying of Michael Gove by Michelle Mone. PPE MedPro was awarded a £122 million contract for surgical gowns that were unfit for purpose and could not be used. That would have covered the cost of a nice inflation-matching pay rise for our nurses. In addition, a second company that Mone lobbied ministers over in an attempt to secure government COVID contracts was a secret entity of her husband's family office. Mone is now said to have scarpered off to Honduras, who happen to have no extradition treaty with the UK. Sunak has withdrawn the Tory whip from Lady Mone, not because of the corruption, but because of Mone taking unauthorised leave of absence from the House of Lords. Rishi Sunak has said he was shocked to read the allegations about the Conservative peer. He must be the only person who was, as her shenanigans have been pretty well known about for several months now. Maybe someone should remind Sunak of his pledge of
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Another Sunak appointment was that of Nadeem Zahawi as Conservative Party chair. The founder of YouGov is worth well over £100 million, and his offshore tax-avoiding shenanigans were formally declared a matter of interest by HM Revenue and Customs. The matter was even flagged to the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson before Zahawi was made Chancellor. But Johnson ignored the issue, just like Sunak is doing. Going back a little further to 2013, Zahawi was shown to have submitted expense claims for nearly £6,000 to pay for electricity to heat his stables to keep his horses warm. Whereas now, because of his party's policies, some of his human constituents rely on warm banks to get them through the week. Clearly, Zahawi values horses more than people. Presumably, part of the reason for Sunak to reappoint Zahawi to the cabinet is a reflection of his desire to provide
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Then there's Ben Wallace, who Sunak retained as Defence Secretary and whose main concern at the moment is obviously the Ukraine war. A modern conflict fought in proxy on many fronts. On the battlefield, obviously, in the energy markets, as we all know, and not least, digitally. It's good to know that in March, a pair of hoaxers reportedly linked to Russian security services managed to get on a call with Ben Wallace by posing as Volodymyr Zelensky. The hoodwinked and shamefaced Ben Wallace then tweeted, "Things must be going so badly for the Kremlin that they are now resorting to pranks and video fakes." This tweet was obviously a vain attempt to demonstrate his adherence to his leader's mantra of
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Next, Jillian Keegan, Education Secretary, another one who stinks of corruption. Her husband's business received government contracts worth £24 million during the pandemic. Both parties, of course, denied any wrongdoing. Then earlier this year, as Health Minister, Keegan was widely criticised for having in-person meetings with bereaved parents, despite testing positive for COVID. You might think that would be reason enough for a Health Minister, no less, to resign. But this was during Johnson's tenure, so nah. But then again, Sunak is no more bothered than Blojo, having reappointed her to the cabinet despite his promise of
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Next, Michelle Donelan, Culture Secretary, and yet another one for the convenient list of contracts awarded during the pandemic. Michelle Donelan's partner, Tom Turner, did rather well out of COVID. His firm teamed up with the company Mighty to deliver PPE to the government at a cost of £360 million. But come on, be fair, how on earth could there be a conflict of interest when Michelle Donelan was at that time an education minister and the contracts were awarded by the Department for Health? Clearly, Rishi Sunak was satisfied there was no link when he reappointed Donelan to the cabinet. I mean, after all, he's pledged to ensure
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Next, perhaps my personal very least favourite minister amongst an incredibly bad bunch, the vicious and nasty Kemi Badenoch, Sunak's Trade Secretary. Cast your mind back to January 2021, when the pandemic was raging. The vaccine rollout had begun proper, And Kemi Badenoch was both a Treasury Minister and an Equalities Minister. Huffington Post journalist Nadeem White had been told that Badenoch had refused to take part in a video promoting the vaccine, so she emailed the Treasury office to ask why. Rather than respond to the email, Badenoch took screenshots and wrote an 8-part Twitter thread accusing the journalist White of bullying, disinformation and being creepy and bizarre, an act which opened the floodgates for online abuse directed at White from Badenoch's army of supporters on the far right. Badenoch was a Tory leadership contender too, and during her campaign she claimed to know what it's like flipping burgers at 16 on minimum wage and then watching my pay slip away to taxes. Except Badenoch was 16 in 1996 and the minimum wage wasn't introduced until 1999 by Tony Blair's Labour government. And also, she would not have hit the minimum income to start paying tax working in a low-wage part-time job. So that was a blatant lie by a cabinet minister, but one that Rishi Sunak clearly believes is not serious enough to contradict his pledge of
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
And next, shudder, Dr. Therese Coffey, our new gaffe-prone, tone-deaf Environment Secretary. Previously Truss's Health Secretary, she came under fire for planning to allow people to get antibiotics without a prescription, which risks germs becoming more resistant, and then admitted giving her leftover antibiotics to a friend, which is illegal. And as Work and Pension Secretary, she called food banks a perfect way to support people in poverty rather than give them meaningful support. She shouted down Marcus Rashford for calling attention to families in poverty on Twitter. She misunderstood how universal credit works, encouraging recipients to work 2 more hours to make up for cuts, whereas in fact it would have been 9 additional hours. She refused to release reports into deaths as a result of benefit cuts. She claimed £200,000 in expenses while cutting benefits. She was also alleged to have hosted karaoke parties in the Department for Work and Pensions during lockdown. But Sunak thought that made her ideal material as Environment Secretary, helping him deliver his promise of
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Next up, self-styled Brexit hardman Chris Heaton Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary. A former chair of the ultra-Eurosceptic European Research Group, Heaton Harris got in a spot of bother as Brexit minister for meeting with Spain's far-right Vox party. Vox is against feminism, LGBTQ+ rights and Muslims, but very much in favour of guns. In 2019, Heaton Harris met with the party's General Secretary in Westminster's Portcullis House, but did not declare this meeting with a foreign political party, a breach of the ministerial code over which he was forced to resign, although the reason he gave was Brexit. Nevertheless, Sunak felt it reasonable to reappoint him as Northern Ireland Secretary, presumably because he felt Heaton Harris was a fine example of
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Next, Mark Harper, Transport Secretary. He was the former Immigration Minister in charge of telling immigrants to go home under David Cameron back in 2014, plastering the message all over vans which toured the country. Except it turned out he himself employed a cleaner who did not have permission to work in the UK. He resigned over the affair. However, Sunak felt that it was appropriate to reappoint this guy to cabinet without compromising on his promise of
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
And last but not least, perhaps Sunak's very finest appointment, the now departed Gavin Williamson, sacked as Defence Secretary by Theresa May after he was accused of leaking national security information related to Chinese firm Huawei's role in the UK's 5G network. Then he was returned to Cabinet as Education Secretary under Boris Johnson, and he oversaw the exams fiasco, which tarnished the futures of an entire generation of children. After cancelling all exams due to the pandemic, he oversaw a standardisation process which downgraded A-level results for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds and rewarded those from more privileged areas, causing uproar, widespread protests and a lot of heartache and distress. As a former chief whip, Williamson has a long track record of being an unpleasant, vicious bully. According to multiple sources within the Tory party, he was heard joking and boasting about how his tactics affected the mental health of the people he worked with. Ex-Minister Anne Milton, for example, told Channel 4 News that Williamson had used MPs' mental and physical health problems against them and had collected salacious gossip about their sexual preferences to get power and leverage over them as a whip. It was also reported that former Conservative chairman Jake Berry had warned Rishi Sunak that a complaint about Williamson had been made during a private meeting. Sunak later acknowledged he knew of the concerns but had not seen the specific texts, which he deemed unacceptable. At Prime Minister's questions last month, Sunak said it was absolutely right that Williamson had resigned and said, "I obviously regret appointing someone who has had to resign in these circumstances." This from the same guy who said he wants
integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level.
Now, I apologise, this video has been a bit longer than usual, so I'll end it there. Rishi Sunak's flip-flopping over the COP27 attendance and his shameful and corrupt decision this week to shatter net zero pledges with the opening of Britain's first new coal mine for 30 years didn't quite make the cut this week, but I shall pledge to return to these themes in future videos. And you can trust me to keep my word, because after all, I do believe in integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level.